Hello everyone, and thank you for looking at my presentation. My proposed area of study for my EdD is to investigate the use of grade criteria in assessment, or perhaps that should be for assessment. And some of you will perhaps already be following my EdD blog that I started in January to try and keep myself on track, and others have perhaps already had conversations with me either before we started the EdD or since then, in which I've explained a bit of the background to where this came from. In essence, my research question started with, do people mark student work in order to try to fail the work, or do they actively seek reasons to pass the work? But that was born of kind of personal interest, anecdotal experience as an external examiner, etc., etc. And of course I realised that if I'm going to research this, I need to look at it in a far more objective and scientific way. And so from that bullet point, I developed my research questions, which are, in essence, how do assessors use the grade or past descriptors, the rubric, whatever name it's known by in the particular place that it's being used, to assess their learners' work. What is their method for applying those descriptors to the work they're looking at? And if indeed it is found that there's any element of either seeking to pass work or looking for reasons to fail it, is this a conscious or subconscious process in the assessor's mind? I realised as I was developing my research proposal that probably I'm going to have to also consider the learner angle of this. I'm very mindful that my big weakness in any kind of research is staying focused on something tight and precise and not allowing myself to digress in many different directions. And I understand from what everyone tells me and from previous doctoral candidates that that's especially an important thing to do at doctoral level study. But that aside, I think I probably do need to investigate a little bit about how learners use the grade and past descriptors as well, because again, observation and a minimal amount of literature that I've looked at so far from the learner angle does seem to suggest to me that there might be a question to investigate about whether learners first of all do use the mark descriptors, but more importantly, do they use them to find out how to get the best possible mark, how to actively pass as the phrase I'm using it, or do they simply use the criteria to look at what they mustn't do if they're to avoid failing, if they're to avoid a very low mark that doesn't reach pass level. So for this task and this presentation, we were asked to choose a single issue. At least that's the way it was written on the sheet, so I'm assuming that we are supposed to think about the one issue. The quote, as you see, says you may use the session to focus on a particular issue or to focus on a particular aspect of your work. Well, here's challenge number one for me, and there's lots of reasons why this is a big challenge for me. And that's, well, how do I think of just one thing that I'm grappling with at the moment, or one particular aspect of the work for this assignment that I'd like some kind of feedback or judgment on. And I quite, well, relatively quickly came up with the short list of 4 things that you can see here. And the first 2, I decided, well, I was having a conversation with a colleague, and something that this colleague who has taught at doctoral level at other universities for a long time said made me decide that those weren't the things to try and focus on here. And I'll come to that in a second with a slightly tongue-in-cheek quote that colleague gave to me. And the 4th item, I suspect that the answer is that I can't, and probably that many researchers, including doctoral researchers, can't get over imposter syndrome. And so I've ended up looking at the 3rd item as the focus of this presentation, but I am just going to make a couple of references to things regarding the first 2 and the 4th. So I'm just going to change screen here for a moment, and I'm going to look first of all at the guidance for this formative task, and this is relevant to my first bullet point that you've just seen. What is the assignment task? Because I have to say that I'm still bewildered, is maybe not too strong a word, but certainly very puzzled as to what exactly the summative assignment task is. And obviously here we can see the formative task that we've all been working on. And then we can see the summative task threshold assessment criteria, and both through looking at the information on the formative task, including further information that was on the Blackboard site and the handbook about how the formative feeds into the summative, and having conversations with my supervisor, which were very reassuring in some ways, but I didn't feel they make things any clearer, and looking at the threshold criteria, I'm afraid I'm still mystified by what exactly the content of the summative task should look like, and I've decided that probably this is the key phrase. Well, I hope it's going to be anyway, and I hope that I realise my mistake and that that's not the key phrase very quickly if I'm wrong. Thinking about the second bullet point I had on there, which was about policy, I still feel more than slightly unsure about what exactly counts as a policy, but I was very reassured by Mark Boylan's slides in the delayed session 1 item, which he delivered online a short time ago, and particularly by this slide, the meanings of policy. Sadly, I missed that session. As many of you know, there was a slight issue with my elderly mother that day and I couldn't get to the session. But these words in themselves are helpful to me, as was a discussion with my supervisor. And then the fourth item that I just mentioned was imposter syndrome, and I think I shared with many of you via the WhatsApp group this document which my physiotherapist actually posted on her Facebook page, and which I found very interesting and quite useful. And one of the key points in this article is that actually, as an athlete, many athletes never do get over imposter syndrome. They live with it, but they don't get over it. And I've begun to think that that's how I have to think about imposter syndrome in terms of the EdD in order to be able to be successful. And so that's how I ended up deciding that, okay, these are 4 things that are preying on my mind endlessly at the moment, but number 3, what is positionality, is the one that's perhaps practical and sensible for here. And particularly so when I was talking to Lynn, my colleague, or our colleague, who's taught on EdDs at other institutions for many years, and she said this. And she said it in a text actually to me, which is why I've put sick at the end and why the punctuation is a little lacking. It's taken straight from her text. And I'm sure that it's not literally true that those people who've already got level 8 qualifications actually like to deliberately confuse, but it does seem as though confusion and the use of big words is quite commonplace in study, actually at all levels, but the higher the level you get, it seems more common. So that's a little aside, a slightly wry smile, and it's also just one of the things that made me think, yeah, let's forget about those first 2 bullet points, let's focus on the positionality. So I had a really good supervision meeting with my supervisor, and she gave me some fantastic feedback and some really, really clear bullet points and answers to questions and targets to focus on. And I think the really key one out of everything that she said was that I've got to focus on the aspects of my positionality which are relevant to my study. And that's helpful in some ways, but leaves me still puzzled in others. I'd focused on my formative task for my supervisor mainly on reading around positionality. I must admit I'd given comparatively little attention to the other matters we had to raise in that formative submission. And I'd particularly looked at some of the texts that were recommended to us, Wellington et al. And their autobiographical approach, the Foote and Gabartel one, Impact of Life Experiences. I had actually focused on those an awful lot in the work I did for my formative submission. I'd also focused on some work by a doctoral a doctor at Hull University, Holmes, and very frustratingly, Holmes's article, which was a 2019 article, a recent one that I accessed through the library gateway, now seems to be no longer available. And as far as I can tell from initial inquiries with our library staff, it looks as though that's because we've terminated the subscription we had to the particular journal it was published in, which is a great shame because I wanted to get that article back and save a copy of it. It shows how I should have done that at the time. And in the Holmes article there was another author, Derry, quoted quite extensively, and I also made use of those things. And I'm just going to quickly flick across actually to the work that I gave to my supervisor, and you can see some of the comments on the side of it there actually. And as you can see, I produced quite a lot of work. It was actually somewhat in excess of the word count it should have been. And this tabulated list here of things to focus on is a combination of things mentioned by those 4 authors I've just referred to, and they were what I decided, because they were common to so many of the authors, would be something I would focus on. But actually, I couldn't understand how some of these things were relevant to my positionality. And as you can see, my supervisor also questioned the relevance. And again, we had a similar thing here, as it happens in both cases on sexual orientation, but there were other things that we discussed in the same place, which were, a similar thing. Well, why is this relevant? How do I establish if this is relevant? Why do these authors suggest that these things are significant in looking at your background and what's informed your position and so on? And you can see that actually when we got to the end of it, well, 2 things happened. One was that in what I actually submitted to my supervisor, I ended this great long section on positionality with this question. So what is my understanding? What is my positionality in relation to research? And Lisa had a helpful discussion with me about that. But I have to say that at the end of the discussion, I was still less clear than I want to be about how do I decide what is relevant. So going back to my PowerPoint slides for a moment, that means that I've had a diverse range of views from literature, including these 4 which I perhaps used too much, and the other literature I'd consulted. And then having got the advice back from my supervisor, I'm still feeling rather bewildered and overwhelmed about how do I sift out the relevance of my positionality. There's also another matter that's now begun to bother me more than it did, and that is how to differentiate between positionality and bias. So I've made a mention here of my own EdD blog, because if anyone's interested in reading more of what I put in for my formative submission, but without the feedback from the supervisor, I kept that on my EdD blog, which I know I've shared the link to with you all on WhatsApp before, so I won't put it on these slides here. So I started thinking very carefully after Lisa's discussion with me, and one of the key things she said to me was, well, when you're writing these things down, you're trying to work out if they're relevant, ask yourself why they matter. Why do they matter to the research question or questions that you want to investigate and answer? And I quite quickly remembered the final assignment submission that I completed on my PGCE at Hallam, which ran from September 94 to June 97. And those of you that are as old as me, and quite a bit younger as well, but perhaps not the very youngest members of our cohort, will remember instantly that in May 1997 something quite significant happened. And one of the things that was most significant was that on the 1st of May 1997, Tony Blair was elected with a Labour government in a landslide victory. And one of the Conservative MPs who was unseated was Stephen Dorrell. And he was on the Radio 4 Today programme as I was on my way to my teaching practice school on the morning of May the 1st, and he made this comment and said that as far as the Conservative Party was concerned, what they mustn't do was say this is the fault of the electorate's got it wrong, but actually look inwards and say this is the fault of something to do with Tory party policy, and we need to find out what it was and change. And I was in the middle of completing my final assignment, which was called the Reflective Practitioner, for my PGCE, and I thought, this is the quote I need for my front cover page of the assignment. And so I turned it round into what you see there on the screen. We mustn't ask where the learner went wrong, but where the teaching went wrong, and we must change it. And that, I think, has been the fundamental underpinning philosophy of everything I think about to do with facilitating learners' success, helping learners to be successful. And as an aside, in my own mind, I don't necessarily see learner success as necessarily being synonymous with learners achieving high grades or even any grades. And I think that underpinned my thinking from long before 1997, and it most certainly still underpins it now. And that leads me to my worry about bias. Because as well as trying to sort out what is relevant in my positionality, and I certainly think that fundamental underpinning philosophy of mine has to be relevant, I am concerned that I might not be capable yet of distinguishing between my position and bias, and that I might indeed be biased and be thinking that whenever assessment is being carried out, it's always the case that the assessor, usually the teacher, is doing something wrong if the learner isn't coming out with a very good result. I hope that kind of slightly hurried explanation makes clear my worry there. At the point I started putting this presentation together, I have to be quite candid and honest and say I was just about at the point of throwing this all up in the air and saying I can't go on. And we are, of course, in particularly unusual and undoubtedly unique circumstances at the moment with regard to the current pandemic of coronavirus and the impact that's having on all of our lives. And so I was thinking about, well, where does this go? Where is my train of thought going on this business of positionality? What is relevant? What is bias? How do I separate them? And as so often happens, just as I was at the absolute point of desperation and about to give up, some kind of miracle happened somewhere, or a butterfly flapped its wings somewhere around the world and caused a gale somewhere else. I don't know what it was, but something happened which meant that I had a completely chance conversation with our colleague Luke Bearden, who mentioned that he was aspiring to one day be the leader of the first ever non-written doctoral programme, because he was working with a lot of autistic learners who are at master's level and beyond, and in non-written communication they, he says, are easily working at doctoral level, more than capable of doctoral study, but they wouldn't ever get through a doctoral programme because of the written communication aspect of it. And I thought, you know, Luke, this is really important and really interesting, but actually I think it's part of my problem because I can articulate things in words so much better than I can, verbally, so much better than I can on paper. So words verbally so much more easily than words on paper or a computer keyboard. At least at first anyway. I think I can get things into typewritten or written text eventually, but often I have to go through it verbally first of all to get it clear in my own mind. And that made me think, you know, so often we find things that are being done now for all people in society, or for all learners, or for all whatever it might be, which only a few years ago were thought of as being something special for people who had a special need. And I thought, you know, there's something in this. Anyway, moving on. That led me to analyse my feelings of why I was feeling so frustrated and ready to pack it all in. And I thought, you know, this is because I'm not having the chance. We're all socially isolated, and I'm not having the chance to have those casual conversations that you end up having in the coffee queue when you're waiting in Cutting Edge, or that you have when you bump into a colleague on the staircase, or whatever it might be. And sure enough, I then went into an online meeting with another colleague of ours, Jean Harris-Evans, only yesterday, and she said, "Oh, how's things going with the doctorate?" I said, "Oh, don't ask." And we actually ended up spending the first 20 minutes of her meeting, which was about something totally different, with her telling me how familiar she was with these feelings, how the same things had occurred to her at the time, because I mentioned to her my issues over positionality, and straight away she said, "Oh, you need to look at these two books," and she sent me the references to these two books, and one of them is this one here, Demystifying Postgraduate Research from MA to PhD, Jonathan Gree. And the other one is this one here, Quantitative Research, The Essential Guide to Theory and Practice, and particularly she recommended page 63 and thereabouts. This is by Savin Baden, which is all about positionality. And I've only had time to have a quick glance at each of these so far, but my word, they make sense. I'm so glad that she mentioned those things to me. And so I began to realise at that point just how important it is to have those casual conversations which aren't happening while we're all socially distanced or socially isolated, while we're all working from home. And as a slightly more worrying in some ways, but in other ways quite pleasing because I can put a tangible label to it, it made me begin to realise a bit of a dawning realisation of just what the impact of my own depression and anxiety is on being able to study, given that most of my depression and anxiety seems to stem, as far as I can tell, from being alone, being isolated. And normally work is where I'm thriving because I'm not alone and isolated. And here we are now in week 6, just beginning, of all SHU people working from home. So those things kind of came together, and they might not all seem very positive, but they gave me a bit of impetus to move on because I thought, it's not just me, and there's ways of sort of moving through this. I'm conscious that I've probably gone over my time by now, but thankfully you'll see that I'm now at the end of my slides, and obviously we're giving peer feedback to each other. And I think the feedback that I would particularly appreciate here, apart from I suppose the semi-obvious question, does what I said make any sense whatever at all, or is it a whole load of old bunkum? But as I've mentioned several times throughout, anything at all that people can suggest, point out from what I've said, books that they've found useful, conversations they've had that can help me to unravel the difference between positionality and bias and the mysteries of how to identify what is relevant positionality, given that some authors seem to think that absolutely everything down to your hair colour is relevant, and others seem to say it's only 2 or 3 things that matter. Anything that can help on those would be really, really valuable to me at the moment. So I do hope that wasn't too disjointed, and I hope it made some kind of sense, at least enough to follow it through to the end. And I hope it's within the time span, which I'll find out any second now when I hit stop on the video and look at how long it is. Thank you very much for listening and watching.